Testing 1, 2, 3, testing 1, 2, 3. Macaroni was ill the day the earth stood still, and he told us where we stand on our feet. Good evening. Let's talk garbage horror movies. Before we dive in, a little disclaimer. When I say garbage, I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. I mean, in the way of horror movies, garbage can manifest itself in a number of different ways. And at the end of the day, they all kind of end up in the same bucket. And when we're talking about horror movies in particular, you will find a whole heap of garbage films. And that is largely because there's really only one rule when it comes to making a horror movie, and that's that there are no rules. Now, I'm sure that there are plenty of horror historians and film geeks who would readily disagree with that statement. But please consider the fact that Psycho, Silence of the Lambs, and the Vomit Gore trilogy all exist in the same genre. And all three movies have taken the rules of how to make a movie and just thrown them out the window. And while I know a lot of you might have a lot of opinions about, well, all three of those movies, you can't really deny that at the end of the day, they are all horror movies. And before the most pedantic of you jump into my comics and say, actually, Silence of the Lambs is a thriller, not a horror movie, explain this to me and tell me that this isn't horror quickly. But getting back to the point that I'm trying to make here is that we are discussing a genre that oftentimes breaks every rule when it comes to filmmaking, which on one hand is great for innovation because you get to try things that you might not necessarily try in any other given time. Like, there are none of the restrictions that you'll find on other genres that you may find on a horror movie. Literally anything goes. You just throw a clump of blood at the wall and see if it sticks. But like the end result of that, though, it ranges from really awesome to really awful. And then sometimes it circles back around and becomes freaking great. And this is the reason why I have a special place in my heart for garbage horror movies in particular. It's that rare and lovely thing when a horror movie, either unintentionally or not, ends up stinking to high heaven and is amazing for that. And to understand why that is for me in particular, you have to understand that when I watch horror movies, I watch them with my own one personal rule. Do whatever you want. Just don't bore me. Bad special effects, bad acting, gratuitous nudity, gore, whatever. Just for the love of God, don't put me to sleep. And so with a great garbage horror movie, you will find some of the most interesting things you've ever seen in the movie. And I plan on pointing out a few movies during this video. But first, as always, a little garbage horror movie history. So, okay, if you really want to dive headfirst into the proverbial dumpster with this, you're going to have to check out some early horror movies. So, okay, in the earliest days of horror, making movies was more about, well, just the act of making movies because it was a fairly new thing. So it was more about making movies and less about making high art. Now, that being said, in the earliest of horror movies, you will find some films that are just studies in the fundamentals of art at the highest scale. But as time was going on and their popularity was growing, early filmmakers were starting to see that horror was a fast track to not only getting famous, but getting bank. I mean, Universal in particular made oodles of cash cranking out Frankenstein, X Dracula, X Wolfman movies in the 30s and 40s. And then the Hammer films that came after in the 50s and the 60s and 70s raked up even more cash. And in those days, horror movies were being pumped out like assembly lines because they knew that they had a target audience, and that target audience was going to come and see those movies. So when a studio starts to see a particular genre as a great moneymaker, they do what they have always done historically. They just throw it out there. They just make the movie and throw it out there. And surprise, the quality starts to go down some. I mean, it didn't happen with every film, but like for every groundbreaker like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, there were like 25 Frankenstein versus Abbott and Costello Stooges movies. And that pattern has gone on throughout horror movie history. And the reason I think that is because when studios start to see a trend that is making them a whole lot of money, they kind of stop giving a sweet Georgia fuck as to whether or not the movies are going to give them any accolades. And when the studios stop giving a fuck, well, an interesting thing happens. Filmmakers start getting a little bolder in what they do in their movies, which in the way of horror movies works out perfectly because audiences start craving bigger scares, more blood, more gore, more silly fake boobs, or whatever. The more outrageous the movie, the better it is. And thus, the symbiotic relationship between filmmakers and the studios and their audiences are forged within horror movies. Now, all that being said, the worst of the worst movies still flopped in their heyday if they were really bad. Case in point, this is Ed Wood, also known as the worst director of all time. And that is because he really was the worst director of at least of his era. He wasn't a great director. And it wasn't just the fact that his movies were bad. And they were bad. They were objectively terrible. Ed Wood's title as the worst director ever came from the fact that he was 300% creative vision and ambition and like 5% skill. And despite the fact that by the 70s, Ed Wood had more than 50 movies and a host of short stories and books, like real novels. Yes, he had crime novels. He had a bunch of crime novels, you guys, which are now on my to be read list. But yeah, despite the fact that he was about as prolific of a filmmaker as you could get, he never really made it beyond D-list. Like, he didn't gain any real fame until way after his death, and he became a cult. His movies became cult classics. See, the great thing about Ed Wood is that he really was the right combination of tenacity and creativity. Like, he was dead serious about his vision when it came to making a movie. No, those visions were warped at times, and his movies were what they were. Nobody can say that he compromised any of what he wanted to do to meet the palate of the public. Now, unfortunately, Wood would never live to see any accolades at all, except for, I think, a golden turkey that he got for Plan 9 from Outer Space. But his absurdly bad films are cult classics now. I mean, I love them. I for one am not mad at it. As a person who loves absurdity and also a writer, I would kill to be able to write something so terrible that millions of people devour it whole. Now, the thing about that though is that in most of those cases, the filmmaker is either in on the joke or they're not. And the shame is Ed Wood wasn't really in on the joke, which is a bummer because I kind of feel like he could have been like the John Waters of horror movies. And he could have, I don't know if he died a millionaire or not, but he could have just doing it on purpose. But whether on purpose or not, I am of the belief that the foundation for a good garbage horror movie is the level of absurdity. Some might say that it comes down to whether or not the film has a low budget, where I would actually beg to differ on that. Case in point, Leprechaun. Leprechaun, the original one with Jennifer Aniston, made $8.5 million on a $900,000 budget. And I don't care what you say about Leprechaun, I would not count Leprechaun as one of the greats. However, I have seen it at least 20 times. But I think that a lot of the filmmakers of today that create your garden variety garbage horror movie understand what Ed Wood understood back then. And that's that the most important thing is to create your vision above all else. And what happens, happens. Now, I just want to say, as a side note, that today's essay was inspired by a thing that happened to me on TikTok, of all places. Because I talk a lot about horror movies on TikTok and here, as will happen sometimes, a recommendation for a horror movie will float my way. This time, however, I actually got a recommendation from one of the stars of a horror movie called Teddy Told Me To. Shout out to Michael Shields, who plays Teddy, by the way, who recommended the movie to me. It was a lot of fun. The link to all of the appropriate socials are, of course, in my description. Cannot say enough that I enjoyed the hell out of this movie. Even though it does fall into the garbage movie bucket, please understand that I do not mean this as an insult. I think this was a really fun movie. Teddy Told Me To hit all of the horror movie bulletin points for a slasher film, for a low-budget slasher film. Lots of boobs, lots of gore, high body count, A+. And it's a pretty simple concept. A couple of people buy an old haunted house funhouse thing. They hire a bunch of characters to work in it, and they are characters, by the way. They all, I am sure that each one of the people that are hired have their own individual backstories that go along with their characters. As it turns out, one of these characters, whose backstory we do get to see, turns out to be a murderer. And the fun ensues. So what makes this movie my idea of a garbage horror movie is the level of absurdity. It's way up there. It's way up there. The kooky characters who actually have a great deal of character development, which wasn't necessary, but it's nice to see. Lots of gratuitous nudity. I'm talking nudity so gratuitous that you will see titties no less than 3 times during the course of this film. I'm pretty sure you see them more, but no less than 3. But the kills in this film make full use of that latex and corn syrup budget. Yeah. But my absolute favorite thing about this film, and the thing that I feel is essential in a good, garbage horror movie, are the cameos. So, okay, I was able to spot at least 4 legit cameos in this film. Lisa Wilcox, or Alice from Nightmare on Elm Street, the dream baby ones, the 4 and 5. Felicia Rose from the original Sleepaway Camp. Hello. C.J. Graham, who was Jason in, I think, the 6th Friday the 13th. And WWE wrestler, The Godfather. His part is the smallest part out of all of them, but it was kind of a shock to see it. And I'm sure there were others that I probably missed. There's at least 1 porn star in this movie. Probably more, but there was at least 1. Watch it and try to guess which one. But the cameos and the blood and gore and the absurd nature of this movie are very much in the spirit of a fun horror movie. I really feel like the filmmaker of Teddy Told Me To was like, hey, horror is my special interest too. And I appreciate the hell out of that. But Teddy Told Me To is a great example of the very thing that I'm talking about. This is a horror movie that is probably not going to get any awards. And most of the population probably will never see this film. But it's bound to gain a lot of fans. And it's at least going to get cult status because boy, was it entertaining. But the greatest thing about Teddy Told Me To is that you never really know what kind of life a movie like this is going to have. Lest we not forget the tale of the legendary Rocky Horror Picture Show. If you don't know the story, let me enlighten you. And mind you, I'm only going to give you the Cliff Notes version. So once upon a time, there was this little play in London about a sweet transvestite from the planet Transylvania. Now, this little play went on to be a huge success in England, so much so that its director, Richard O'Brien, was approached to make a movie. So, of course, he does it because why wouldn't you? And he cast mostly all of the original actors from the play, with the exception of Brad and Janet, who he cast as 2 American actors. Oh, Meatloaf too, but I believe Meatloaf was in, even though he's an American actor, he was also in the original play. Anyway, After a grueling production full of pitfalls, including Susan Sarandon catching pneumonia, the movie gets made and it's put out there into the world. After which, it bombs hard, hard, like really, really hard. Like there were no signs of life kind of hard, like dead on arrival. So, okay, for the record, the Rocky Horror Picture Show's budget was $1.4 million. How much did it make back in the box office? $450,000. And to make that worse, that was over the course of the first 6 months. $450 spread out over 6 months. It ranked at 1,643 at the worldwide box office. So if you looked up the definition of flop in the dictionary, you would find a pair of lips. So unless you've been living under a cave for the past 50 years, you probably know what happened next. Somehow, this movie ended up hitting cult status. And not just cult status, cult status. As a result, I don't think that there is a state in America that doesn't have some theater that is showing Rocky Horror Picture Show at least one night a year. And if there is, it's probably a red state. But yeah, what Rocky Horror has in common with every garbage movie that's ever existed is its absurdity. And the best part is Richard O'Brien is definitely in on the gag. I think the most shocking thing to him about this was that it was ever a success at all. Like seriously, he created a story about a horny mad scientist that came from a planet of drag queens. You will never convince me that Richard O'Brien ever thought that he was going to get an Oscar for Rocky Horror Picture Show. And I don't know, I think that in the current state of the world where objectively cartoonishly evil people keep doing cartoonishly evil things, I gotta say, it's nice to escape with a glass of wine and Attack of the Killer Tomatoes every once in a while. And that's this week's video essay. Thank you so much for listening to me rant for a little while. I post every 2 weeks, so make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can see every new post when it comes out. But yeah, that being said, keep watching bad horror movies because they're really amazing. See you next time.